Good morning, everyone. I would like to extend a warm welcome to all of you joining our CITBA webinar titled Debt Dynamics and Fiscal Policy, which will be presented by Dr. Alvin Lau. My name is Sook. I'm the economics lecturer at JC Singapore Business School, and I'll be moderating today's session. So before we begin, I would like to remind our audience of a few housekeeping items. Firstly, this webinar will be recorded for publicity purposes. All attendees may ask questions at any point of the webinar through the Q&A function. The Q&A session will take place at the end of the presentation, and at the conclusion of the webinar, we will conduct a satisfaction poll and survey, and we kindly request that you take a moment to provide your feedback. Lastly, if you encounter any technical issues, please use the chat button to communicate with our event organizers. So now, without any further delay, it's my privilege to introduce our speaker for today, Associate Professor Dr. Alvin Lau. Dr. Alvin is a distinguished Associate Professor and the Head of Strategy in the Faculty of Economics and Business at Universiti Malaysia, Sarawak, also known as UNIMAS. With an international reputation, Dr. Alvin has held visiting positions at the University of Cambridge and various universities in Indonesia. He's actively involved in research, consistently publishing high-quality scholarly articles and presenting at numerous international conferences around the globe. His research excellence has been recognized through multiple awards, including Young Researcher Awards at UNIMAS, the Excellent Service Award, Research Medal from Research Expos, Best Papers, and the Highest Impact Journal Paper Awards. Dr. Alvin ranks among the top 9% of economists in Malaysia and ASEAN, and is in the top 10% for Asia according to the Research Papers in Economics Network. Furthermore, he is one of the highly cited authors at UNIMAS. Once again, it's a true honor for me to have Dr. Alvin join us today to share his expertise on debt dynamics and fiscal policy. And the floor is yours now, Dr. Alvin.
All right. Thank you very much, Ray, for introducing me, and thank you very much, actually, JCU for inviting me to this important webinar that talks about the issue of debt dynamics and fiscal policy, which highlight some of the importance. I'm going to highlight some of the importance issues actually related to these two particular importance policy making for any country in the world. So I'm really honored, appreciate everyone who attended this webinar this particular morning. So let us, these are some of the things that I'm going to mention this particular morning. What is actually about debt dynamics, what is actually behind the issues of debt itself. And the second part will be on debt and fiscal connectivity, I call it. How does fiscal policy and debt are interrelated with each other, which is, of course, a very important partial of the dynamics inside the policies of any government in the world itself. And then the third part is about sustainable debt and fiscal policy itself. And number 4 is about the issues about finding the magic threshold about the debt. What sort of a threshold of debt which should be enough or should be more or something like that, right? So as been already introduced by Sook just now, that this is a bit one page of my profile itself, which everyone would be able to look at it. I hope everyone can hear me loud and clear. If not, you have to mention to me. I mean, this is about myself. They've already been introduced just now, so I have skipped through this one. So I start off with this picture itself, or this writing itself about till debt do us part, or meaning that in any country, individuals or so on. Take for example ourselves. If we borrow from others, and it becoming a kind of a liability even to an individual. So imagine that ourselves, when we have, I mean, when you live in this world, that we have that itself, how much that we are on other people in that particular sense, that bring up the issues of debt itself towards, that is from the individual perspective. And you can imagine that also at the same time, the government that the government of the day or the government of any country in the world borrow from others, borrow from perhaps World Bank or Asian Development Bank, for example, or IMF and all the other international organization, and after that use that money to generate the economic growth, or to generate to ensure that the country move forward in that sense, so that they can have a kind of money for the purpose of ensuring the sustainable growth of any particular country in the world. So that's one of the big function of borrowing and related to that itself, right? That I can pretty much explain in the very beginning here. So this picture shows that perhaps the issues about that itself is very much important, not just for ourselves as an individual, but also for the country level, how actually we can manage the debt, what sort of percentage that is enough, what sort of percentage that going to be a negative impact towards the growth of the country. And it's very much linked towards fiscal policy, because it's supposedly this money been borrowed, used as part of the expenditure in the country to ensure that, as I said just now, the country grow and so on. So I started off with such a thing. And of course, if you have any particular question, you always can point out, as mentioned just now, put in a question and answer. Let me forward to the next one. Right, so basically already explained this part that about what we have in any countries in the world. We have what we call as fiscal policy and monetary policy, which is called economic policy, and how these two policies are actually being mixed or being used in the country, in the sense whether we have it's not just these two policies are useful when we are in the crisis, but even when we are not in crisis, the policy makers also will use this the function of fiscal policy or monetary policy, or both, to ensure that the country grow, as we mentioned, in such a way, right? So to give you a glimpse of what we have right now, this is the latest one from IMF itself, from International Monetary Fund, where they have the data for gross debt position in terms of percentage of GDP, in terms of colored here. So means that the much more a striking color, which is red in color, means that the debt actually goes beyond 100% or 75% to 100% and so on and so on. The lighter the color means that the country position, that gross position in that particular country, measured as a percentage of GDP of that particular country, means that it's a lighter in that sense. So they don't have the data. If you don't have the color, they don't have the data for that. So they only have, if you see red color, a bit yellowish or orange in color, means that the percentage of that in the world. This is the latest data that I gathered from, or the picture actually I gathered from IMF itself. So this is a truly interesting infographic to show that how much actually, or how big is actually the debt for each country in the world. If it zoom in into here, where we are right now, or especially Southeast Asia, Malaysia, Singapore, Indonesia, Thailand, the Philippines, we are like in the yellowish color and in this kind of color, right? So meaning that this, interestingly, that we are in this level of debt according to the data from IMF, right? According to the data from IMF, in the range of 25% to 25% up to 75%, right? That's the range of the gross debt position in the ratio of GDP in that particular sense. So I start off with that idea behind what you are doing here, right? Let me go to the next slide. And accordingly to the data just now, and accordingly as what they explained, that the debt level actually have increased significantly for the past few decades, especially for the developing countries. The trend have seen for developing countries increase, and this is very pronounced or significantly increased, especially during the past few years of the COVID crisis, of the COVID-19 pandemic crisis. And according to the latest, like I say just now, the picture, the previous slide shows that in 2020, actually, the world total debt level nearly reached 100% of the GDP. That's in 2020. And 2021, actually, it moved down a little bit to 97%. And 2022, this is the real data. I should correct this word. It's no longer projected. The 2023 data shows that 2022, actually 92% all over the world on average of the picture that I show you just now on average. This actually, according to IMF, is actually shown the improvement from the recovery from the pandemic itself. And of course, fiscal policy plays an important role in this regards. Of course, to ensure that how we move forward with all the geopolitical instability, with all this inflationary pressure and whatnot around the world, that should not be continue on or what we're doing for the past few years, because in the past few years, giving up or expenditure have been increasing, and of course that translate into, in one sense, if it, to borrowing and so on, which related to debt itself. And this issue becoming much more significant because of the reason developing countries, as we all understand that even Asian developing countries, for example, they might have a limited funding, especially compared to the developed countries. But in the time of pandemic, I think the pandemic have hit every country in the world, and this is what been founded. And the latest IMF, especially the Fiscal Monitor and the World Economic Outlook, have suggested that numbers of policy making look forward, especially for this consolidation or normalization types of policy, fiscal policy, that can ensure the world moving forward on the recovery pace. Although each country in the world have different recovery pace. That's what I would say in it for this part. Right. So again, this is the data. This data is actually also from the IMF, but it's up to 2021 in that sense, to show that the difference between emerging markets and advanced economy in the world, starting from the 1880 on average, all the countries, and especially in this COVID time, the numbers actually have moved up. And as I mentioned just now, on average, it's about 100%. But then again, if you go by, we divided into advanced economy and emerging economy, this is the numbers that you can get about the percentage. This historical public debt database by IMF, and now have reduced below about 92% and going down, hopefully, for the next few years in terms of policy normalization that they've done. Right. So the connectivity just now, if you see that the connectivity between fiscal policy and debt is because, of course, as I mentioned earlier just now, was if you don't have enough money for, especially for running the country, then we have to borrow to ensure that we can ensure the country can go on with the activity that have been planned, especially on the government expenditure side, if you don't have the kind of enough reserve in that particular sense. So this kind of policy option is there. So that and fiscal policy connectivity is very close. These are few questions that I can raise up in the mind of everyone here, is that and what I've been doing also for the past more than a decade, some of the publication that I've done, what's the motivation behind that? These are the question is relevant today, is also relevant when I firstly have this in my mind about 15 years ago, about are we fiscally and financially sustainable? We can ask that question to ourselves as an individual, and of course to the country itself in the macro management, in the macroeconomics policy. And number two, there is about what's the link between fiscal space, debt, and growth. How much should be enough? What's the space we should have? What's the buffer that the country should have in that sense? Same goes to ourselves. Do you think, I mean, the question that we can always ask ourselves is, are we financially sustainable? Can we sustain for how long if we don't, if we're not working, and so on and so on. And number three, there is about are they actually magic threshold value for the debt growth connectivity? Debt and growth connectivity, what's the threshold? 50%, 60%, 40%, 30%, and so on and so on. Each country uniquely, right, not having a different threshold itself, which can generate positive impact towards growth or negative impact towards growth and so on. So this major question have motivated me for the past at least when about 15 years that do research related to either that related to fiscal policy and finding the magic threshold. With that several things that I've done. So of course I started off some of the research, like for example this one paper that co-authored with one of my research associate from or research friend actually from Prof Jayaraman from Fiji itself. So we do the countries of the Pacific Island, which is south, and of course we find that this is a panel regression study. We find that actually the external debt in this sense, or external debt in this sense, actually positively impact the growth of this Pacific Island, because the Pacific Island countries actually needs this kind of or the inflows or the aid itself towards that and the borrowing to ensure that the country grow in that sense. And the EXP here is called export. Exports also positively impact, external debt positively impact. But if you see, of course, if you see the coefficient based on statistical analysis, that on average the export or in one sense do contribute to the growth of each of the country itself. And export and external debt positively impact the growth of the country. And this one BD is budget deficit, which is related to fiscal, whether it's positive or negative in that sense. Fiscal deficit or fiscal where expenditure more than revenue, then is negative, or budget deficit, and how that's actually contributed. And only Fiji actually have positive impact. The rest of the countries there, the PIC, actually have negative impact on the growth itself. Means that budget deficit is not perhaps in this sense not a good thing for this sets of country. This is one of the paper that published some years back, 14 years ago. This paper published 14 years back. And the next one also, we actually look at the other types of the ASEAN country. If I know, this one we applied into 19 ASEAN countries. And we look at the external debt again, the issues about debt itself, and this talks about sustainability, whether the debt itself is sustainable in that sense. The first question just now that I posted up, and of course we have suggested this paper published in 2013, if I'm not mistaken, about 10 years ago, that is important. That is going upwards at that time for the ASEAN countries since 10 years ago. And we suggest that, of course, government should maintain the sustainable path of the economic growth in the near future. And of course, they also need to talk about debt stabilization, debt stabilization act. They need to have a kind of a fiscal rule related to that, which already been put in place since then for these ASEAN countries itself. And of course, at that time, 10 years back or 14 years back, we do not, me and my co-authors, we do not explore about the threshold, not much about the threshold. But the later papers of the later publication, we explore about the threshold, some of the, that one that I can share with you. This is another interesting paper that published in 2014 while I'm visiting University of Cambridge, and this is actually the intersection or the relationship between how external debt, GDP, and how export can be kind of complement, or in that sense, export actually supposedly positively impact GDP, and external debt can have negative or positive impact. But the causality direction, the picture down here shows that actually external debt impact GDP, and then also export and import, no, just export and GDP actually cost each other. So there's a direction here from external debt through to GDP, and then or there's another direction from export to GDP, and we have indirect causality from external debt to GDP and to export itself. So this is how the intersection or the interaction or the causality can be detected from this group of countries. Again, the data was ended up before the global financial crisis. So the experience and the empirical results will be different comparatively right now, more than 15 years ago, right? And of course, the next paper that we also interested to see, this is basically just focus on Malaysia and how this paper looked at the determinants, the important determinants of external debt is in Malaysia. What variable that important? What rather important that we see here, that I highlighted here in red color, this one is say to show that how actually external debt, impact GDP. Of course, this is what we always interested to see in any part of the country. How it's actually impact GDP based on this impulse response function graph. The impact from positive towards negative means that the longer the time period of this impulse response that we analyze, is found that the external debt moved from positive impact, and after a few years, after, if I'm not mistaken, 3 years, based on the analysis here, the impact becoming negative towards GDP. That's what we found for Malaysia itself in this particular regards. Let me move forward for the next one, right? And what sort of paper, what sort of research actually, as we discovered with my co-authors, that talks about, for example, this one paper that talks about sustainability of fiscal imbalances of fiscal policies in that sense in the East Asian countries. So here, if I'm not mistaken, we adopt, because the paper published back in 2007 in this journal, and we focus on 5 countries, including Malaysia, Philippines, Indonesia, Thailand, and South Korea at that time, because these countries were the countries that was hardly hit in the last 20 years crisis of ASEAN economic crisis, or ASEAN financial crisis, ASEAN financial crisis in 1997, 1998. So that's the focus, whether there's a regime change. In that sense means that we look at the structural break of how actually these policies have been done before and after the crisis, and what changed in that particular sense. And we actually acknowledge, or we actually look at, of course, some of the countries, they are fiscally not sustainable, and some of the countries actually are sustainable in that sense. Before and after, we have a different view because of the crisis itself. We also measures and how fast the adjustment, if anything, happened towards this particular imbalances or not sustainable in that sense. So this paper, the other research also related, talks about the fiscal conduct in country, and this one applied to 24 developing countries, not just ASEAN, but this one opened up into some of the African countries and some of the other region country into the sample here. And we test, of course, with several econometrics methods, and we found that actually on average, on this average, is that most of the countries actually supported the sustainable condition from theoretical point of view, from our empirical result. And when we look into each of the country, when we look into the panel itself, the panel's studies, it seems like the 24 countries are actually sustainable. But then again, if we look into the countries, each of the countries, some actually sustainable, some not sustainable. Why that happened? Because of the high deficits, of the high imbalances of each of the country, of how the interconnection between them. So we look in it, then This paper was published 2010, and the other paper related to the first and the second paper was talking about, and this focused more on the ASEAN countries again. The sets of countries, I think, if not mistaken, 10 ASEAN countries here, and of course, at that time, our focus, because it's published somewhere in 2009, the focus is of course on the ASEAN financial crisis. Not including the global financial crisis scenario in that sense. And since then, we have proposed talking about consolidation, talking about how actually can enhance growth, not just using the kind of deficit types of scenario, which is not favorable for these 10 ASEAN countries. Let's look into this is more latest one. Not so latest, 2016, this published. And what is rather important in this regards also, let us look at, for example, this one and this one, response of GDP towards external debt, response of GDP towards external debt for the country of Thailand and the Philippines. We can easily see that actually the response actually moving from, of course, from zero here. This is the zero line. This is the zero line, but here is all negative here for the case of Philippines and the case of Thailand here. So it's moved from positive to negative. That means that the impact towards time, after several years, the impact of that to the growth of the country is from positive to negative. Same thing like Malaysia just now at the beginning that we found. So this is what we found earlier on. And of course, we also do the other co-authors also do the kind of like the other analysis on fiscal reaction function, which is related to this one paper is related to this another paper on Malaysia itself. This one published in 2021 that zoom into this direction. If you look into here, if everyone look into this particular direction, it seems like at most times since 1970s for Malaysia case, and in most of, including Thailand and the Philippines, similar pattern that we found, that in most of the time we are in deficits or in following our methodology. This is what we call as a not sustainable period. And and only few years that above the zero means that in positive numbers of the fiscal policies of fiscal positive budget positive rather than deficit itself. So this proved that the issues about sustainability. So whether it's in although it's in negative, although it's in deficit, how long can we sustain this kind of scenario bit by bit? But this has been proved. For example, like country in like for example in Malaysia itself, we still have these issues of deficits in our budget since 1997. I would say that since 1997 until today, we have recorded since then for the past 25 years, at least for Malaysia, the fiscal in deficit. And now I think last year the percentage was quite big. And this year the government targeted a much more lower, with of course all the other policies or consolidation that they are doing towards this particular direction, right? And the last part, which I'm going to share with you here, I hope I take another maybe 5 more minutes or 10 more minutes so that we can have some question if you have. It's about the magic threshold. Finding the magic threshold is like finding something that is significantly might impact the growth of the country. What is the number? Is there any magic number? Is there any magic formula actually for any countries in the world to know the kind of the threshold, whether it's the debt threshold, whether it's or the budget threshold, and so on and so on? What's the level of negative of the deficit that we should have, or the percentage that we should have for the triggering? What's the tipping point for that, right? So, and like this paper itself that published somewhere in 2017, that that focus actually on fiscal sustainability. Again, the focus is actually on Malaysia, and we found that using the simple analysis of the threshold analysis, this is the threshold that we found at that time itself. For this one, actually, you can see that if the debt itself is below 41%, or if you round it up is 42%, then it's positively impact the country. If the debt is around 42% up to 55%, rounded up, then it's still positively impact, but the impact of the positive is much more smaller right now compared if it's below 41%, and it is above 55% of ratio of GDP, the debt level, then it have a negative impact towards the economy itself. So that's what we found in the based on this paper. So and the data is of course way before. I think the data ended up either 2014 or 2013 for this research itself. This is what we found. 55% is actually the threshold for Malaysia, for example, or the debt threshold itself. Beyond that is negative. Below that, it still have positive impact towards the country growth, right? So this one paper that we found, very interesting result that we found, and the paper that we published last year with my co-authors, my friends, that that we found that from the data up to 2016. Of course, this data is before the COVID-19, and the data at least actually covers up all the major crises that we have, from the commodity crisis, Asian financial crisis, global financial crisis, which actually shows the swing of this debt, upward trending of the debt, and then going down and going up again, going down and up again, which is a rather interesting observation that we found. And of course, the paper actually suggested that, and the paper, inside the paper, we suggested, or we count, or we actually calculate the threshold for these countries, or the 16 countries that we have here in our analysis, and this is the percentage itself. Of course, this is based on the formula that we have, that we get, that we come out with this threshold for each of the country. And not only that, we go beyond this calculation of the threshold, and we compare. For example, we set the threshold, for example, the threshold, like giving one example, perhaps here, like Malaysia here, all right? The threshold for Malaysia, this is threshold, the red line, and then the blue line is the plot of the external debt to GDP ratio. And if it's above the threshold, means that it's not sustainable. Our argument is that if it's below, means that is moving towards, means that you have not reached the threshold. The threshold is there, so it's still below the threshold. It still can positively impact the country growth itself, in that particular reason. So that's how we plot up, and we explain in such a way to see each country, especially the ASEAN here, would have a different impact towards how it impact the growth itself. The threshold is a guideline, it's a tool, but not necessarily it's an ultimate number. That's what we argue in our paper, not necessarily the ultimate number, because it might be differ accordingly to perhaps the method that we use, the data that we have, and of course the sample period. It might differ. With the more later sample, then we might get much more different scenario perhaps. And one of the latest project that I do with some of my friends, this have not been published, or I've not shown this totally, just a sneak peek of what we are doing here. This is more about fiscal multiplier, on how actually the fiscal multiplier impact the growth. This is from the perspective of total expenditure of a country. In this case is Malaysia. We found that actually total expenditure multiplier, this sample including COVID time. One is before COVID. We sample it up to 2019 Q3. The other one is 2021 Q2, at least up to Q2. We found that this is the kind of a rebound, kind of a multiplier. It goes up The multiplier means that how it impact the country growth, and it dropped like here in the case of including the pandemic, it goes from about let me see, about 0.3, and then it goes down, or sorry, 0.21 in the first quarter, and then it decline afterward and goes back to positive. So it's like a kind of a J types of impact towards the country growth. Means that the longer period of time of the longer in this sense is our quarterly data, it impact positively towards the country growth, taking into consideration of the pandemic impact. Perhaps this is what we see right now. This is what we see right now. This is from simple impulse response analysis. This is what we see right now. The impact positively, despite that the government have given up assistance and so on. Maybe, for example, like in Malaysia, the government have given a lot of assistance in terms of cash and whatnot to the people, to the society, especially the pandemic time. And now the adjustment is there, although it's hard. The adjustment coming back positively towards the country itself, right? It's one. The second one that we found, interestingly, just now is about total expenditure. This is revenue. Revenue seems to have a negative impact towards the growth from our point of view, the data that we have. The multiplier slightly like the rebound from this figure to the other figure, and towards the quarter of the period, sample period that we have based on our analysis. So I think this is what I can conclude for this particular morning. I try to keep myself as much as possible into timing, and thank you for listening. I've seen a lot of numbers of questions already inside the chat box, so we discuss further on that part. Thank you very much. I stop my share.
Hey, thank you very much for this very informative presentation, Dr. Evan. Now, especially how you provide us with substantial empirical insight into what could be an appropriate debt level or threshold for like different developing nations, and also the economic impact of debts for many for different developing nations. And it's interesting how using different kind of methods, you consistently find that external debt may bring positive growth impact to the developing nations, but once it exceeds the threshold, when it becomes excessive, such an impact will turn negative. So I think this is also a very significant topic, considering the growing concern over the rising debt problems in developing nations, especially in Asia. I think, in fact, the IMF has been warning about the debt problem of Asia since 2022, highlighting that several Asian countries are facing debt distress and calling for fiscal consolidation in this nation. And also, not to mention the tightening global financial condition that we are facing now have further complicated the debt issue. So I'm sure our audience will have many questions for you. And like what you notice, there are already several questions in the chat, in the Q&A panel. So without further ado, let us proceed to the Q&A session of the webinar. Okay, so I think the first questions is I would like to discuss is the question raised by Professor Peter Hoffman from JCU Business School. The question is, it seems that more developed countries take on more debt as percentage of GDP. So regarding the threshold, would you expect those countries to have higher threshold relative to emerging countries? And if that's the case, what would be the potential reason for that?
All right. Thank you very much for this. Let me just kind of try to address what I think in that sense. This in this regard is true. Actually, it's true. If you look into the data itself, I mean, even into the IMF or World Bank, or I mean, whichever data they're using, actually, the debt actually percentage of GDP more comparatively of advanced country compared to developing country. But we do not empirically. I do not explore my research on not much, I should use the word. I do not really explore on developed country what's the threshold level, but what we believe in, of course, one thing that we should know about the difference between developed and developing countries. The ability on serving the debt is supposedly higher in the sense of developed country compared to developing countries. Developing countries always, of course, we borrow, of course, for the need, but then again, paying back might be another issue. That's why it keep prolonged, and we call it debt overhang issues, which have been around for developing countries for numbers of years, including there's numbers of countries actually receiving the aids to help to build up this nation. But fortunately, in this region, in Southeast Asian region, I think we are not being categorized in such a condition yet. In terms of threshold, I could not really answer directly because I do not do much, I do not do at all on developed countries. But what I do on developing countries, yes, the threshold seems to be getting higher and higher. Perhaps if you look at my research, especially when we do back, for example, like country of Malaysia, in Malaysia itself, when you found in 2017 on the earlier data, we found about 55%, and later on we found that the threshold actually have increased more than that, about 60% and so on. And right now, even the country itself has actually proclaimed that the debt level is about 65% out of the GDP. So whether that threshold actually would impact negatively or positively, there is something very empirical work, but we are doing it. One of my latest project actually looking into this threshold for Malaysia. Itself, how it actually and look into different perspective. But thank you for that question.
Yeah.
I hope I answer you that.
Yeah. I think one of the main reasons is, as you mentioned, the credibility, because usually developed countries, they are in better positions to borrow more. And also, I think another reason is developed countries, they tend to have like a deeper financial market, which allows them to take up a higher debt leverage ratio. And we also look forward to your future work that explore further into this issue. We have another very interesting question. I think, firstly, you mentioned about the Asian financial crisis. So one of our audience is curious about whether we will repeat the history, whether we are repeating the history of the 1997 Asian financial crisis. Do you think the chance of having a similar crisis is likely? I know it's a very challenging question, but it seems that we are in a similar situations, like what we faced prior to the Asian financial crisis. So what is your comment on that?
Yeah, I think if I'm able to answer this or provide or predict, or anyone who can be able to predict the next crisis or whatever crisis that's coming out can become the next Nobel Prize winner. But anyhow, yeah, coming back to that, I think the scenario is different compared to 1997. That's from my perspective. I think in 1997, Asian is moving too fast. That's what my understanding. Moving too fast in the sense we grow, double-digit growth and so on. Everything seems to be okay. So FDI is flowing into the region. The exchange rate is good. The country growth double-digit. Everyone is doing mega projects and everything else. In the ASEAN itself. And suddenly poops, the exchange rate comes, financial market, the stock markets and everything, and then everything collapsed. Perhaps at that time, I would say that it's about our fundamental. It's more towards the fundamental issues. But I think 25 years later now, the ASEAN countries have learned the hard way. And going back to whether we're going to have another round of like what ASEAN financial countries, perhaps not, but we might expected a slowdown of the ASEAN countries, where all the big brothers having the slowdown. Perhaps the impact will go back to ASEAN also. When China have the slowdown, US have slowing down, then the impact also directly and indirectly towards ASEAN. But towards the kind of crisis like ASEAN financial crisis, I do not think so in that particular reason. We just come out from the pandemic. I think it's time to grow. If we going back to another crisis, that will be hard hit for the countries all around in the ASEAN countries. Hopefully not with what policies and what been done and consolidation, what they have been taking forward into their policy option for all the countries in ASEAN. So it's time to help. It's time to not just individual countries, but ASEAN itself as the bloc itself should help the other member states in that sense if anyone having any issues. Right. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. There's another like prediction type of questions. But I think this is also quite interesting and relevant because it talks about the current global economic climate. Considering the current global trends of rising inflation and the rising US dollar, which I think will certainly have an impact on the external debt, because a lot of these external debts, they are issued in US dollar. So this audience asks, how do this factor may impact the debt dynamics of Asian developing countries? And are there any specific challenges or even opportunities that may arise from these trends?
Yeah, thank you for this another hard question to respond in that sense. But what do I think about that? Of course, as we all know that now, since last year, actually, the issues about inflationary pressure is already there. That's why numbers of countries actually have used monetary policy to tame down the inflation. But some works, some might not work 100%. And that raises up a lot of other things, the price of the goods and the, of course, affect cost of living, affect livelihood, because we just come out from one crisis, we want to go another crisis, slowing down. And these big brothers, for example, in ASEAN, the China and Japan, they are actually slowing down. China actually is, slowing down. Of course, the impact from the pandemic, and Japan have been there. If I use that word, perhaps some Japanese might not agree with me. I think they have been growing not as much as they grow perhaps 20 years back or 30 years back. They have been there since sustaining in such a way. So if they're having certain issues, of course this will affect the inflationary impact, will affect the debt, because this is what indirectly will affect the debt itself. But from the empirical point of view, we have not, me and some of my co-authors, we have not really looked at how the latest inflationary pressure would have on that itself, how it can impact. But from my perspective, theoretical perspective, yes, you're going to have some impact. And of course, the countries, the ASEAN developing countries, have to take a much more strict rule in that sense. Or like, for example, in this country, Malaysia itself, I think since last year, if I'm not mistaken, early last year or the 2021, the government actually committed to go ahead with what they call as, it's like a fiscal rule, but they want to make it official, like a Fiscal Responsibility Act or something like that, that they want to be presented. They want it to have what kind of consolidation or rule that can they follow, so that they will achieve this by this year and this year. Of course, each other countries also have their own ways of doing so. This is what I can find here in in Malaysia, which actually they already expected something like this might happen, soon after we finish up the pandemic. Now is the time of what IMF call as normalization. Is that fiscal policy might not work single-handedly, so it must be accompanied by monetary policy also, with the interest rate control or increase or decrease, and exchange rate and whatnot, money supply in that sense. So this works best, but at the same time, it's going to impact the borrowing, the debt that we have, the debt that we serve. So it's going to impact.
Okay, yeah, thanks. I think following that questions, you have briefly mentioned about some policies that's been taken by the Malaysian government, which is related to these two questions. So I think I will just consolidate these two into one. One audience asked, what kind of policy recommendation would you suggest for these Asian developing countries to navigate their debt dynamics and fiscal policy in a post-pandemic era, given the current global economic climate? And since this is such a broad questions that look at the Asian region, if you may, maybe you can also share more with us in the context of Malaysia. Given that you are the scholar from Malaysia, so could you share with us, could you share with us, what the government can do to address this rising debt problem?
All right, thank you very much for that. I think from that policy option that we have, that the government have, I'm not talking behalf of, this is just from my personal point of view, not from the government point of view. As what I seen last year, and of course this year they presented again the budget of the country budget. Last year they presented the budget, and then they committed to sustainability. They committed towards the budget sustainability. They committed towards the deficit in budget itself first, which is related towards that itself, because you have to serve the debt that they have. And of course, the government itself also have increased the threshold, the threshold itself from what they believe in at 55%, and then right now I think the threshold stand about 65%, which is almost, I think the debt level is almost reached that maximum level already. They increase it, so that they have a kind of space to navigate around the policy that they can do. For example, if you want to reduce expenditure, you cannot just reduce straight away. It must go gradually. If it's reduced straight away, then some of the quarters might not have the money to do a lot of projects and everything else, which impact the growth of the country also in the end. So this is kind of the kind of weighing. We do this, you must do at the same time like this. So it cannot just be one policy all over, although our focus is just on that. We have to reduce, of course, but then again, we have to know that if reducing this thing means that the money around the country itself might not move that much. So it need to be complement with some other things that should be done. So I always believe in doing not just the mixture of policy is important, not just one way, not just fiscal policy. You can do monetary policy at the same time, like what all the governments in the world are trying to do right now in taming the inflation. They increase the so-called the overnight policy rate, and then after that, what's the impact? And of course, at the same time, they have to strengthen the exchange rate. At the same time, also, they have to reduce the debt by not reducing all the expenditure, but selected ones, which is thing can be, I mean, the expenditure that can be cut off, we cut off. But the expenditure, for example, towards health, towards education, or social implications, social safety, this should not be reduced, because this is important for the country. I mean, for any country, not just Malaysia itself. So I think this is all been written inside the budget or the policies that the government want to do starting from last year towards this year, and hopefully it works. And the target of the government, the current government right now on the budget deficit, I think they want to reduce it to the numbers of like 5.5%, if I'm not mistaken. The last year 2022 figures was, I think, 6.5%. They want to reduce it up to that, so that by 2025 they can reach about 5% or below 5% of deficit, which will be translated into the debt itself. This one reduce slowly, this one will reduce slowly, but gradually. You cannot do straight away. It's going to it's going to impact more, negative impact, because as we understand, I mean, from economics point of view, expenditure is important for any country. Government expenditure is important because it's part of, like, using a simple Keynesian model. The G there is important to boost up the GDP. So if you want to reduce that, you must find alternative how to replace all those things, right? The other part that, of course, any government can do, which is relevant, is which is what they are doing right now, is targeted towards certain quarters that really needs help, not or not everyone, subsidy not for everyone, subsidy for several targeted. This is what they've been doing also as of now. And the next thing I think they will do is that they will reduce the expenditure for certain industry or certain sectors, but they only focus on those can give a high impact or high ROI in that sense towards the economy. So I think that's what it can be done in that sense.
Yeah, I think this is a really, a complex topic that may worth another webinar contributing to, address their questions. As we are approaching to the end of our webinar, I think I can only take in the last questions here. There's a rising attention on the debt problems of Japan and China. We know they have such a gigantic amount of debt, especially for Japan, both being the leading economic superpowers of Asia. So, what is your evaluation of their current debt sustainability, and what may be the implications for other developing nations, especially within the Asia Pacific region?
Yeah. Correct. You were right on that part. Not only China and Japan itself. Actually, as been asked earlier on just now, the debt level actually for developed countries actually much higher than the developed countries. So that's why they might have a different threshold. Like I say just now, this threshold itself are very unique. Depending on the scenario of the country and so on, you cannot generalize, says that okay, every country must have 60%. No, it's not. I cannot have one ring rule all or one solution for all. It must be very specific based on the country scenario and so on. So, like given the example of Japan, which have actually high debt, US also actually high debt. I think Singapore in some sense also not too bad. The debt itself, the ratio of the debt level. Then again, it goes back to the capability of this country, of how it's going to impact the other neighboring countries itself. When they are slowing down a bit based on whatever pressure that they have. But it has been a tool. I have not particularly analyzed China and Japan particularly, but their debt level, of course, have gone beyond in some years they go beyond 100% of the GDP, but they're still growing in that sense because they have others that support or the ability of paying back much more higher compared to other developing countries. And I think, as I mentioned earlier just now, we can have a look of this sustainability issues of the debt itself on China and Japan, which have not explored in detail, although there are some of the countries that I analyze inside there, but we look at the general, not specifically. But in this region, ASEAN itself, especially Malaysia, we have looked into a lot of this sustainability measurement and whatnot. So if I had to I mean, I cannot just compare like that, but Malaysia, like I say, very unique. Whether they're sustainable, as of now, they're sustainable, even their growth. They can pay back, they can serve, and they can have a growth, although their growth might not be 10% and so on. But perhaps 5% is good enough for them. But China is a different story. They are double-digit growth because of their industrialization and whatnot. They really needed that kind of money to grow further, and these have I think their investment and whatnot have come back to the country, and they ensure that the whole not just the country, but the positive impact, the spillover towards the other ASEAN region. But it's interesting what you mentioned here. Now I'm thinking about maybe another research that can be done, is that how this spillover, how this dynamic debt spillover can be impacted the rest, rather than, I mean, can look at this like a methodology that can analyze the spillover impact of not just the financial market, because mostly look at financial market impact of the or the exchange rate market, but can look into the debt impact of this country towards the rest of the ASEAN. That is something to look at. Sorry, thanks for the idea.
Yeah, thanks the questions raised by the audience for providing us a new research idea. Okay, thank you, Dr. Alvin, for your valuable insights and your great answers to all of these questions. As we come to the end, I'm confident that our audience will agree that this session has been really thought-provoking. I would like to express my gratitude to all the attendees for joining us today, and also, especially to Dr. Alvin for sharing your knowledge with us. Before you leave, a satisfaction poll will appear on your screen, and I kindly request a few seconds of your time to respond. With that, we conclude the webinar. Once again, a heartfelt thank you to everyone and to Dr. Alvin, and I wish you all a delightful afternoon.
Thank you.